May 7, 1945. A cold, still morning settles over the outskirts of Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Bavaria. The war in Europe is hours from ending, but here, inside a requisitioned U.S. Army command villa converted into an interrogation center, the air feels thick, metallic, and strangely suspended. A place caught between two eras, the ruins of the old world and the uncertain machinery being built to replace it. Bootsteps echo against the stone corridor. Papers rustle. Cigarette smoke hangs in a thin blue sheet above the lamplit table. Paul Nitz pauses in the doorway. He's 40 years old, an American economist turned naval intelligence officer, lean, sharp-eyed, exhausted from weeks of travel through conquered Germany. His uniform is creased. Dust clings to his boots. For the past months, he's walked through aircraft plants blown apart by Allied bombs, steel mills reduced to carcasses, and fuel depots scorched into blackened craters. He carries a notebook, dog-eared and swollen from rain. Across the room, already waiting in a straight-backed wooden chair, is the man he's about to question for the next 7 days. Albert Speer, former Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, Hitler's architect, the bureaucratic engineer who kept German factories sputtering long after logic said they should have collapsed. He sits with polite posture, hands folded, eyes alert. His gray field jacket looks too clean for the chaos that ended the regime he served. The war is ending, but in this room, another war is beginning. One fought with data, evidence, and the truth of what had really destroyed the Third Reich. The MP at the door closes it quietly behind Nitz. For a moment, only the ticking of a wall clock dares to cut the silence. Nitz pulls out a chair and sits. He doesn't start with accusations. He starts with production numbers. "Minister Speer," he says, sliding a typed sheet across the table, "you were responsible for managing Germany's armaments output. I want you to walk me through these figures, month by month. Explain what broke you and when." Speer studies the sheet. His face remains controlled, but his shoulders shift almost imperceptibly. He knows this isn't a simple interrogation about guilt. Nitz is here representing the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, an enormous operation tasked with understanding the true effects of Allied air power. Behind Nitz, a stenographer prepares her machine. Another officer, Major Charles Kindleberger, one of America's rising economic minds, leans against the wall with a folder under his arm. They have one mission: determine whether strategic bombing was worth the colossal effort. Whether the thousands of bombers and tens of thousands of airmen had actually accelerated Germany's collapse. Whether air power could decide future wars. Speer exhales. The mask slips just slightly. "You already know the answer, Herr Nitz," he says quietly. "The turning point was oil." Nitz leans forward. "Explain." Speer begins not with factories or with tanks, but with a date burned into his memory. May 12, 1944. On that day, more than 900 American bombers roared over Germany in a coordinated strike on the Third Reich's synthetic oil plants, Luna, Bolin, Politz, Brix, and others. Places where coal was liquefied and hydrogenated into the lifeblood of the German war machine. Speer describes the sound, the vibration, the moment he knew something irreversible had begun. Before that day, German production had been rising, making miracles from shortages, rebuilding faster than the RAF and USAAF could knock them down. He tells Nitz that the armaments industry was like a wounded animal forced to run harder, improvising, dispersing, working nonstop. But the oil campaign, that changed everything. Nitz listens, expression unreadable, while Speer recounts the collapse. Fighter squadrons grounded from lack of aviation fuel. Panzer divisions stranded. Training flights canceled. Synthetic plants burning for weeks. Rail cars filled with coal but unable to move it to hydrogenation facilities. "You could bomb a ball-bearing plant," Speer says, "and we would recover. You could destroy an aircraft factory, and we would disperse it. But without fuel, he taps the table. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe was finished. The Panzerwaffe was finished. Everything else was irrelevant. The stenographer's keys clatter furiously. Nitz writes his own notes, but his mind is already jumping ahead. If what Speer is saying is true, then the war was decided not by dogfights or battlefield maneuver, but by petroleum spreadsheets, by refinery throughput, by a calculation. He asks the next question carefully. And when did you realize Germany could no longer match Allied production? This time, Speer doesn't flinch. Much earlier. Perhaps late 1942. He folds his hands again. You Americans had outbuilt us before we even understood what you were capable of. Nitz exchanges a glance with Kindleberger. This is what they came for. Not excuses. Not ideology. But the truth about industrial capacity. The engine behind modern warfare. Because the United States had not merely outproduced Germany. It had dwarfed it. Crushed it mathematically. A nation of assembly lines versus a nation under blockade. The outcome, Speer implies, had been inevitable long before the first bombs fell. The clock ticks on. For 7 days, this room will become a laboratory of economic warfare, a place where numbers become weapons, and where two men on opposite sides of history dissect the collapse of a world that is still smoldering outside. The interrogation has just begun. For the next hour, the interrogation room becomes a map table of collapsing empires. Speer talks, and Nitz listens, leaning forward, pen scratching, his eyes narrowing as he follows the threads of production figures, ration charts, and the quiet desperation inside the Third Reich's industrial ministries. Outside, the alpine air remains cold and still, as if the mountains themselves are holding their breath while history rewrites what everyone thought they understood about the war. Nitz begins pressing more directly. What I want to know, he says, placing another sheet on the table, is how much the oil campaign degraded your armed forces. I want specifics. Speer adjusts in his chair. His voice lowers. In June 1944, he begins, we still had aircraft, thousands actually, but we could not fly them. Fightergruppen reported less than a third of the required training hours. Some pilots received only 30 minutes in the air before combat. Others, none at all. He raises his hand, drawing a line downward in the air. Fuel allocations to the Luftwaffe fell by 75%. By fall, they fell again, until entire squadrons sat idle on runways, waiting for fuel that never came. Kindleberger scribbles a note. Nitz doesn't look up. Speer continues. You must understand, this wasn't a gradual decline. It was a cliff. After May 12th, after your bombers hit Luna and Politz and Merseburg, we could never recover. The synthetic plants were too complex, too fragile, too interconnected. Once they were destroyed, nothing else mattered. The stenographer's keys hammer the words into permanence. Nitz flips to a new page in his notebook. Then let's talk about armor, he says. Panzer divisions, what happened to them? Speer's reply is immediate. They died of thirst. Not in North Africa, not in Russia, here. He taps the table again. In Germany, in their own homeland. Tanks without fuel are not tanks, Herr Nitz. They are monuments. He leans back, and for the first time since the interrogation began, he looks older than his 50 years. The Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, they were powerful machines, but they were helpless without the one thing we couldn't replace. We built tanks faster than we could fuel them. By the winter of 1944, even elite panzer divisions were assigned fuel rationing so severe they were told not to maneuver. They were to act as stationary artillery. Nitz looks up now. You mean they were immobilized? Yes. Many were abandoned intact. The crews destroyed the guns and radios, but left the hulls. You can find them along the roads in Hesse, Thuringia, Silesia. The fuel shortage killed the Panzer Force more efficiently than any battlefield action. He pauses. And it wasn't just tanks. Trucks, half-tracks, locomotives, everything required fuel. When the oil stopped, Germany stopped. Nitze sets his notebook down. Minister Speer, he says slowly, you're telling me that the Luftwaffe, the Panzerwaffe, and the entire German logistical system collapsed not because of manpower shortages or lack of materials, but because of... Speer finishes the sentence for him. Oil, Herr Nitze, only oil. There is no pride in his voice, only finality. The ticking of the wall clock seems louder now, echoing through the small room. Then Nitze stands. He walks to the window, folding his arms behind him as he looks out at the peaceful Bavarian fields, fields that had once fed a machine built for conquest. He thinks of the American oil fields in Texas and California, the refineries at Baton Rouge, Baytown, Richmond, the tankers lined up along the Gulf, the pipelines stretching across an entire continent. The United States hadn't simply produced more, it had produced so much more that the comparison felt surreal. He turns back to Speer. Why didn't Germany understand that the war was lost? He asks. Speer sighs. Because we believed we could compensate with ingenuity, with discipline, with willpower, but we were wrong. War in the 20th century is not decided by courage alone. It is decided by industry. Nitze nods, slowly, gravely. This is exactly what he suspected, and exactly what the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey needs to confirm. He closes his notebook. We continue tomorrow, he says. The MPs arrive to escort Speer back to his guarded quarters. Kindleberger gathers the papers. The stenographer stretches her fingers. As they exit the room, the lamp over the interrogation table flickers, casting long shadows across the documents that will soon shape the foundation of America's post-war military doctrine. The first day is over. 6 more remain. And the revelations are only beginning. The next morning, May 8, 1945, V-Day, dawns with a strange quiet over the Bavarian Valley. Church bells ring faintly in distant villages. U.S. soldiers gather outside the villa, listening to the crackling radio announcement that the war in Europe is officially over. But inside the interrogation room, nothing has ended. Paul Nitze arrives early, sleeves rolled, a half-smoked cigarette still between his fingers. Kindleberger is already there, spreading maps across the table, production charts, refinery diagrams, transport logistics. The stenographer adjusts her machine. They're preparing for something more intense than yesterday, a line-by-line dissection of Germany's entire war economy. At 0900 hours, Albert Speer is escorted in. He sits down silently, but the atmosphere has shifted. The fall of the Reich is now a fact, and he knows every word he gives will be carved into the historical record. The only battlefield left is this room. Nitze snaps open a folder. Minister Speer, he begins, today we talk numbers, exact numbers. You have claimed Germany was outproduced beyond recovery. I want the details. Speer nods. He has come prepared. He starts with aircraft. In 1944, he says, we produced just over 39,000 aircraft. That was our peak. But the United States, he gestures toward Kindleberger's charts. You produced nearly 100,000, and that is only aircraft, fighter, bomber, trainer, transport combined. Nitze doesn't react, but inwardly he feels the weight of it. The U.S. produced more planes than the Axis powers combined. Speer continues, you built more heavy bombers in 1 month than we could build in 3. And those bombers, your B-17s, your B-24s, carried payloads we could not match even with our best Heinkels and Junkers. He lifts another document. Your fighter production, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, exceeded our Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs by margins that made recovery impossible. After 1943, every German fighter we built was already overshadowed by the next wave of American aircraft. Kindleberger steps forward. It wasn't just planes, he adds, it was engines. You produced twice as many aircraft engines as planes. We know you were operating on single-engine inventories, repairing old units, cannibalizing crashed aircraft. Speer gives a tired nod. Correct. We ran out of engines before we ran out of airframes. Pilots flew with rebuilt power plants patched together from the remains of shot-down aircraft. Nitz writes this down, not because it's surprising, but because it confirms the theory that air dominance wasn't simply tactical, it was industrial. Let's move to armor, Nitz says next. Speer folds his arms. In 1944, we produced roughly 19,000 armored vehicles, but the United States, between the M4 Sherman, the M3/M5 Stuart, the M10 tank destroyer, and others, produced more than 50,000. Nitz raises an eyebrow. Nearly 3 to 1. And that, Speer says, is before considering that your tanks could drive. Ours increasingly could not. The room falls still at that. Speer then points to the largest chart of all, total wartime industrial output. This, he says quietly, is what defeated Germany long before your troops reached the Rhine. The chart shows it brutally. United States industrial output greater than the Axis combined by nearly 2 to 1. Steel production 5 times greater than Germany. Automotive production 20 times greater. Shipbuilding unmatched in human history. Fuel production nearly limitless. Speer places both hands on the table. You were a continent. We were a fortress under siege. We never had the resources to match you. Not in machines, not in manpower, not in fuel. The war was decided not in 1944, but in 1942, when your factories reached full capacity. Nitz stops writing. He looks directly at Speer. You're telling me the war was lost before D-Day? Before Tunisia, Speer replies. Before Kursk, before Italy. The moment America mobilized, the numbers decided the war. Nitz steps back from the table. He feels the truth settling in. The U.S. had not simply won the war. It had outproduced the very concept of German warfare. Tanks, guns, planes, every unit on the battlefield represented a factory floor thousands of miles away. Industrial capacity had been the real front line. But he needs one more answer. He picks up a sheet listing Germany's synthetic fuel output in metric tons. When, he asks, did the oil situation become mathematically irreversible? Speer doesn't hesitate. May 12, 1944, he says again, when your B-24s and B-17s hit Luna, everything after that was simply a matter of time. Silence returns. Outside, celebrations continue. Music, laughter, soldiers shouting, clapping each other on the back. But here, in the interrogation room, Nitz feels something different, a cold certainty that modern war is no longer about battles, generals, or maneuver. It is about industry. It is about numbers. It is about the capacity to sustain destruction indefinitely. He closes the folder. We'll continue tomorrow. Speer is escorted out. Another day of revelations ends. But Nitz now knows the final outcome of World War II wasn't just a triumph of strategy. It was a triumph of production. May 9, 1945. A gray mist settles over the mountains as Paul Nitz returns to the interrogation room for day 3. The celebrations of V-Day have faded into a quieter, stranger atmosphere, one in which soldiers smile with relief, yet officers move with renewed urgency. Because victory doesn't end questions, it begins them. Nitz enters the room with a stack of new documents, German fuel allocation tables, captured at Magdeburg, reports from Luftwaffe training commands, panzer maintenance logs from the shattered fronts in Hungary and the Ardennes. Kindleberger stands beside a blackboard covered in chalked calculations. When Speer is escorted in, he immediately senses the shift. Today will not be about production. Today will be about mobility, the bloodstream of warfare. Nitz wastes no time. Minister Speer, he begins, yesterday we established that the oil campaign crippled the Luftwaffe and Panzer divisions. Today I want the precise chain of collapse. I want to know how fast mobility died inside the Reich. Speer clasps his hands. He seems almost relieved to speak plainly. It died faster than anyone on the outside realized, he says, and far faster than Hitler would allow us to admit. Nitz slides a document across the table. It's a report dated August 1944, summarizing aviation fuel reserves, a meager fraction of what they had been only months earlier. Explain this, Nitz says. Speer adjusts his glasses. In early 1944, we allocated around 180,000 tons of aviation fuel per month, enough to sustain fighter training and operations. After your May attacks, that fell to 70,000. In June, 30,000. By September, he pauses, we were down to 10,000, sometimes less. Kindleberger stops writing. That isn't sustainable for even a token defense, he says. No, Speer replies. Fighter squadrons were grounded for days at a time. Instructors begged for fuel just to keep pilots familiar with their aircraft. We had aircraft on paper, Herr Nitz, thousands of them, but without fuel, they may as well have been museum pieces. Nitz flips to another sheet. This report claims the Luftwaffe flew only 200 training hours in November 1944, total. Speer nods miserably. That is correct. Across the entire Luftwaffe? Yes. The stenographer pauses, looks up in shock, then resumes her rapid typing. Nitz moves to the next board, pinned with maps. Let's clap about transport. Germany had once prided itself on mechanized warfare, blitzkrieg, fast, mobile, decisive. But the documents Nitz has reviewed show something radically different by late 1944. He gestures toward a table. These numbers suggest entire Volksgrenadier divisions were transporting supplies by bicycle. Speer answers instantly. They were. And horse carts, and civilian automobiles jury-rigged to run on wood gas. Fuel had to go to tanks and aircraft first. Everything else, infantry supply, food, ammunition transport, was forced back into the 19th century. Nitze frowns. You were fighting a modern war with medieval logistics. Speer gives a tired smile. Yes, while you supplied Patton's army with fuel through a pipeline stretching hundreds of miles from Normandy to the Rhine. Nitze doesn't respond, but those words land heavily. He knows the truth of them. American fuel lines had advanced with the armies, pipelines, tanker trucks, depots, refineries. The U.S. Army could move faster not because of superior tactics, but because it could afford to move. Germany, by contrast, had been shrinking, its mobility constricting like a tightening fist. Now armor, Nitze says. He places a report from the Eastern Front on the table. It details the final weeks of the Wehrmacht's tank forces. Speer reads it, then nods slowly. This was the end, he says. Panzer divisions reduced to a handful of tanks. Tiger battalions receiving only enough fuel to move their vehicles a few hundred yards. Crews draining fuel from wrecks, commanders ordering tanks to be hidden in barns to preserve their last leaders. Nitze taps the paragraph that matters most. Many tanks were abandoned fully functional? Yes, we lacked fuel to withdraw them, reposition them, or even rotate them for maintenance. Our mechanics could repair engines, replace transmissions, but without gasoline, it made no difference. Kindleberger writes a note. Tanks defeated by fuel shortage, not combat. Speer continues. In the Ardennes offensive, your Battle of the Bulge, we had tanks, we had experienced crews, we had terrain advantage. What we did not have was fuel. The offensive depended entirely on capturing your fuel dumps. Without them, it was doomed the moment it began. Nitze closes the folder. He already knows the American report. German armored thrusts stalled not because of enemy resistance, but because their tanks ran dry. One final topic remains. Railways, Nitze says, explain their collapse. Speer exhales sharply. They were the first artery to fail. Your bombers severed the lines that carried coal to synthetic plants. Without rail transport, our fuel production could not recover, even if the refineries were repaired. We had coal, but no way to move it. Nitsa leans forward. And once the coal stopped, Speer answers with a single, devastating sentence. Once the coal stopped, the war was over. The room falls silent. Outside, trucks rumble down the road. U.S. Army vehicles, fully fueled, fully supplied, already preparing for redeployment. Their engines echo through the valley with a confidence Germany had lost long before surrender. Nitsa looks at Speer. In your assessment, Minister Speer, what finally ended Germany's ability to fight? Speer meets his eyes. Not the bombs alone, not the battles, the loss of mobility. When we could no longer move men, machines, or fuel, we ceased to be an army. We became statues waiting to be destroyed. Nitsa closes his notebook slowly. He has what he needs for today. Tomorrow, he says, we examine industrial dispersal. Speer nods. The MPs escort him out. Another day done. Another layer of truth exposed. But Nitsa suspects the most damning revelations are still ahead. May 10, 1945. The Bavarian sky is a dull sheet of gray, hovering low over the valley as if pressing down on everything beneath it. A chill breeze sweeps over the pine trees outside the villa, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant smoke from villages still clearing rubble. Inside, the interrogation room feels tighter than before, its walls crowded with new maps, blueprints, and reconnaissance photos pinned in overlapping layers. Diagrams of factories dug into mountainsides, aircraft assembly lines relocated to forests, machine shops hidden under barns, labs moved into abandoned mines. Today, Nitsa intends to unravel one of Germany's most desperate efforts to survive the Allied onslaught, the dispersal of industry. He stands at the chalkboard when Speer enters, his sleeves rolled and hands already dusted with white chalk. Kindleberger is arranging aerial photos on the table. The stenographer loads a fresh ribbon into her machine. Nitsa doesn't even sit. Minister Speer, he says, you once described industrial dispersal as the last illusion of the Reich. Today, I want to know why. Speer sets his cap aside and takes a seat, looking almost resigned. Because it gave us hope, he answers quietly. False hope. Nitsa taps a map of central Germany. Black lines trace the rail networks. Red circles mark destroyed production sites. Let's begin with aircraft manufacturing, he says. Your factories at Regensburg, Wiener Neustadt, Gotha, Marienburg, they were heavily bombed. So you dispersed production. Hundreds of small workshops, thousands of subcontracted sites. Explain the logic. Speer folds his hands. The logic, he says, was simple. If the Allies destroyed one factory, we lost everything. But if production was divided among dozens of smaller sites, hidden in woods, cellars, tunnels, we could continue building planes. The Messerschmitt 109, the Me 262, the FW 190, they were all built this way in 1944. Nitsa points to a photo of an underground tunnel complex. And the Mittelwerk facility? Speer nods grimly. Yes, the V-2 rockets were assembled there, under the mountains of Nordhausen. It was the most ambitious dispersal project we attempted, one driven by desperation. Kindleberger adds quietly, we've already seen the site. It was extensive and inhuman, Speer answers. The room freezes for a moment. Nitsa continues. You dispersed aircraft construction, tank assemblies, engine plants, ammunition factories. But did it actually work? Speer's lips tighten. In the short term, yes, we built more aircraft in 1944 than any previous year. Nitsa steps closer. And in the long term? Speer closes his eyes for a breath. In the long term, dispersal destroyed us. Kindleberger lifts a folder full of transportation reports. Nitsa begins pacing. Explain, he demands. Explain why dispersal failed. Speer straightens. Because dispersal multiplied our needs, he says. More sites meant more transport, more movement of parts, more railway usage, more trucks, more fuel. He raises a finger. And fuel was what we no longer had. Nietzsche stops pacing. A realization settles into the room like falling ash. You're saying dispersal required a transportation system that no longer existed? Exactly, Speer says. We created a logistical nightmare. Wings built in one region, fuselages in another, engines miles away, all converging at final assembly points that were themselves vulnerable. Every rail line we used was a target. Every truck convoy was exposed. Every delay cascaded into weeks of lost production. Nietzsche holds up an intercepted German memorandum dated February 1945. This document claims that many aircraft completed in dispersed workshops never reached the final assembly plants. Speer nods. They didn't. They were stranded, unfinished, undelivered, immobilized by the collapse of transportation. I recall one assembly facility with nearly 100 Me-262 fuselages waiting for engines that never came. And why didn't they come, Nietzsche asks, though he already knows. Because the trucks meant to deliver them had no fuel. The stenographer types the words with a slight shiver. Nietzsche moves to the chalkboard again. He writes 2 words. Dispersal equals fragmentation. Minister Speer, he says, you once told your staff that Germany was building weapons in pieces that would never meet. Was that literal? Speer lets out a slow, defeated breath. Literal. Entire production runs were lost because the components could not physically reach each other. Even when we hid factories, the Allied bombers did not need to find them. They only had to destroy the transportation connecting them. Kindleberger interjects. That's why the railway bombing campaign devastated you. Speer glances at the map behind Nietzsche. Yes, you didn't need to hit the factories. You hit the arteries. And without rail transport, industry cannot function. Not dispersed industry, not centralized industry. Nothing functions. Nietzsche nods, absorbing the strategic implication. He knew the oil campaign crippled mobility, but the rail campaign strangled the very idea of industrial survival. Speer finishes the thought for him. We believed we could hide our factories, but we could not hide the networks that fed them. A silence settles. The clock ticks. Outside, an American Jeep drives past, engine humming smoothly, powered by fuel delivered across oceans without interruption. A reminder of the scale difference, the industrial certainty the U.S. enjoyed throughout the war. Nietzsche sets down his chalk. Minister Speer, he says softly, you once told Hitler that dispersal would save the Reich. Speer nods. I believed it then, or I needed to believe it. But dispersal was not salvation, it was fragmentation. A system that looked formidable on paper, but collapsed under the weight of its own complexity and under the pressure of your bombers. Nietzsche sits at the table and closes his notebook. Tomorrow, he announces, we examine the oil campaign in full. Speer looks down at his hands. He knows that tomorrow will reveal the true moment Germany's defeat became irreversible, not through military losses, but through the annihilation of its lifeblood. The interrogation ends. Speer is escorted out. The documents remain scattered across the table like pieces of a machine that can never be reassembled.